Folks, we're at it again, which is to say the 9 early comment. But tonight, it's because I was participating in the Downtown Independent Democrats executive board meeting. Now, if you're unfamiliar, I did many times before, but it's worth reiterating. Your local Democratic club is a great way to plug into local political organizing and what's going on in your local community. Today, they organized a conversation with Brian Kavanaugh, who's chair of the Housing Committee. So I just happened to come from the executive board meeting today because of the work of Downtown Independent Democrats. I had the opportunity to be part of a Zoom conversation. Somebody has a lot to say and a lot of influence over what happens regarding housing policy. And right after I tell Simon hello. Okay. So as I was mentioning earlier today, I was lucky enough. I mean, I'm involved, so I got the email and the invite, and you could do the same if you had a good you happen to have a Democratic club where you live and you're signed up to be involved with them. If not, you can always join mine, Downtown Independent Democrats, DIDNYC.org or DIDNYC on Twitter. But that being said, we spoke with Brian Kavanaugh, and what did Brian Kavanaugh have to say? Well, there were a couple of things that he mentioned. Perhaps first and foremost is that there actually isn't any sort of eviction moratorium right now that's been put in place by the governor or the legislature. I know that sounds weird because we keep talking about these moratorium on evictions, but actually it's just the courts saying that they can't enforce evictions right now. Basically, it goes like this. If you're evicted from your home, the court has to send a marshal to undertake the eviction. Because of the situation and because it's so hard to hear cases between tenants and landlords, the courts have basically said they're not going to enforce eviction law or hear cases on it right now, which is a very ad hoc situation for tenants to be in. There's no official policy that prevents eviction of tenants. It's just that the courts have on their own decided that they can't handle it at the moment, and they keep extending this as the pandemic wears on. However, to give you a sense of just how capricious this can be, today, literally today, the courts decided that they would begin to execute evictions and continue to process eviction cases that began in March before the state of emergency was declared. So all this is to demonstrate that the ban or the pause on eviction proceedings in the courts that had up until now been preventing people from being put on the street has now begun to unfreeze a little bit for folks who were facing eviction before the pandemic. And honestly, while we can quibble over the semantics of before the state of emergency, after the state of emergency, I think we can safely say that the state of affairs right now is such that the city and the state are unprepared for any folks to be getting folks who are being evicted are in a much weaker position to find relief than they otherwise would have been. So it's not as if folks who were facing eviction before the pandemic are now in the same position as they would have been, and that's just being unfrozen and everything is ceteris paribus or all of the things are being equal. Everybody's in a worse position now. So evicting them is a tougher matter for those tenants. But again, to reiterate, the courts have begun to unfreeze the eviction process and are now working through that backlog. So the first thing Brian Kavanaugh mentioned was that, and said that the governor should issue an executive order extending a actual moratorium, or even better, the legislative Kaplan. Michael Kaplan says story on NPR about national retailers leaving NYC. New York Times reporter mentioned a jeweler who closed his store and had been contacted by potential landlords about restructuring a lease around a percentage of sales instead of a fixed rent. Interesting. Always love to see new innovative business models from landlords. It's just not something that happens very often. But yeah, I mean, that is separate from the residents. Obviously, they don't lose their homes but New York's economy is certainly suffering because of the pandemic. Now, go to residential tenant relief. Ultimately, there's two thoughts on this. One is to simply cancel rent. That is to say, it's a law saying that nobody owes rent for the time of the pandemic. And the other position is to have a government bailout of tenants, which is effectively a government bailout of landlords, because tenants, the tenants so that they can stay in their homes, but all that money basically gets transferred to the landlords. So we're going to talk about two things. One, which one of those is better? And two, what the mechanism would be to accomplish them. So first and foremost, which one of these two solutions to the problem is better solution? Brian Kavanaugh, understanding of contract law and constitutional law, it is very, very much for the government to simply take things from private citizens because of that due process clause in the Constitution, Fourth Amendment. You're entitled to your property, life, liberty, and happiness. Really, it was a modification of the phrase life, liberty, and property. But the reality here is that whether or not you believe that should just be canceled, landlords should take a government's power to capriciously decide that it wants to take people's property and force a use of it, which is effectively what saying nobody has to pay rent comes down to. Now, just clarify for a bit, we've been over this concept many, many, many times on this live. You might recall that up till a few weeks ago, we were reading through one of the seminal documents which gave rise to the U.S. Constitution, which was the Magna Carta. And one of the major innovations of the Magna Carta and the entire Enlightenment after it, which was effectively the genesis of the strain of thought which led to the U.S. Constitution and modern democracy, is limited government to prevent the capriciousness, be sovereign, and reallocation of funds, and how unconstitutional that is. Well, ultimately, this all comes down to the idea that the government can't capriciously, at its own discretion, take things from people without their consent or without due process through representative government and through the court of law. So why can't a representative government simply pass a law that deprives one class of people of their property, even for a limited period of time? Well, it has to do with the fact that even though you might have representative government isn't just about, it's about the constraining of power the government has to do certain things. And so the due process section of the Constitution, which is, again, the Fourth Amendment, puts serious shackles on what the government can do when taking property, on what the government can do when taking property. That is not just money through taxation, but also physical property in the form of land. You see this all the time in eminent domain cases. Eminent domain is something that gets a lot of attention when it happens because it is effectively the government taking people's property. But one of the really important parts of eminent domain is that even if the government decides it is going to take your property for public use because it's in the public interest, it has to compensate the owner of that property at market value. Now, we can argue whether or not the government actually ends up compensating people at market value or the calculations of market value are fair. But what we can't argue is that when the government decides to force property owners to do something with their property, it is legally responsible for compensating them for that use. Therefore, under the takings theory, forcing landlords to tenants for free would violate the Constitution. And there's really two problems with this, two big problems. The first is, even if you did it, it would get challenged in court. And if you failed in court, if the government failed in court, then you know exactly where you were when you started, except you'd have confused a lot of people and generated a lot of problems for tenants and landlords with all of these, with a very uncertain legal. Second thing, which I think is, I mean, personally, I always think it's important, but in the zeitgeist, it may be more important than normal. It's important, but in the zeitgeist, it may be more important than normal. Is the idea that these tiny things or attacks on the Constitution and the principles of the Constitution actually add up to something meaningful. So we can say, and some people do argue, that we should just push for it and pass something and let it get hashed out in court. But honestly, I think if there's one thing that we should all appreciate now, it's that little attacks on the constitutions, legislators really just going out there and being like, I don't care what the Constitution says. I'm just going to do this thing because I think it's popular, or I think it's the right idea, or I want it to happen. Those minor cuts and scratches on the constitutional framework really do eat away at it over time. And when they come fast enough in a short enough period of time, you get a real defraying of a sense of what is constitutional and the capacity of the institutions to uphold that Constitution. And during a national emergency, it is ever more likely that these things will be upheld. Attacks on the Constitution will be upheld because people who act need relief. And this is actually what we're seeing from the Trump administration in its use of the executive order to change tax law and reallocate money assigned by Congress. Tax when applied to things like cancel rent, less important, any less rigid, and it prevents the government from doing, or individual actors in the government from undertaking. So Brian Kavanaugh is of this opinion. I think he made a pretty strong argument for it. I am never, I don't think, ever going to be in favor of an idea which I deem to be unconstitutional just because I think it'd be a nice thing to have. My first allegiance is to the Constitution because ultimately the democracy and the limited government that it enshrines for this country is the thing that makes all other things possible. Which brings us to the second potential solution, which is the government bailout of tenants, which, yes, is also the government bailout of landlords. And we may not like that, but we'll talk in just a moment about why that happens to be the case. This is somewhat unique to, but ultimately, this is what the government is empowered to do, and it's really the federal government that has to do it. The state governments actually don't have the power to do this, which is also one of the infuriating things about the situation. In theory, the state legislature could pass a law which would cancel rents. But yeah, sure, it will be unconstitutional. Let the courts worry about that. Let the arc of history worry about that. And if it happens to actually pass muster, let the defrayment of the Constitution be considered in a generation for the argument there. Unfortunately, the alternative isn't particularly, it is more legal perhaps, but it doesn't feel more workable at the moment because the money required to bail out all the tenants is a lot. It's a lot more money than the state has, and the state can't just produce money. Only the federal government can do that. And so it relies on the feds to reach a consensus in the legislature and pass a spending bill. Now, how much money are we talking? Well, Brian Kavanaugh told us that in the HEROES Act, which is the actual bill, which was passed in the House, which the Republicans refused in the Senate and are trying to negotiate down, is $100 billion for the states. $100 billion. $10 billion of which, and this is, sorry, $100 billion for rent relief for the states to allocate. $10 billion of that rent relief for the states to use is for New York. And for Brian Kavanaugh, $10 billion by his calculation is more than enough to handle this rent crisis in the moment. So that would mean that in negotiations, if this number were to be cut, we would still come out in a pretty good position as long as something to the tune of a few billion gets passed so of bailing out tenants and then bailing out landlords is that you also get the bailing out of property taxes. So instead of governments instead of the federal government just transferring money to state governments, you have the added mechanism by which the federal government subsidies landlords, which then transfer money to the local, municipal, and state governments, which is sort of like a double whammy for that particular allocation of resources. But let's talk just for a second about why bail out landlords? Why are they deserving when basically every other industry has to take its lumps? And isn't the great thing of capitalism, that individuals assume the risk of business? And the answer to that is, yep, that would theoretically be the great thing about market capitalism. The problem with real estate in a situation like this, and honestly, we have spoken about market failures before, and I love talking about market failures because free market capitalism is a super interesting system that has a lot going for it, honestly. And one of the wonderful things about free market capitalism is that it's easy to model. That's one of the most wonderful things about it, and that's why economists like it and mathematicians like it, because you can model it with a couple of assumptions about behavior, and you don't have to worry about the capricious politics of the internal human psyche as individuals make decisions that affect the economy. So it's nice that there's this invisible hand, because if you can come up with a couple of assumptions for how the invisible hand works, you can do things with algebra, and calculus, with math, right? So this is actually a market failure, and it is a collective action problem. So there is which have to be met for markets to function perfectly. One is perfect competition, by the way, works on both sides. It works on the supply side and the consumption side. So in this case, we have a virtual monopsony, which is to say that a single buyer, when you have a situation where you have a single buyer, it's as distortionary as a single supplier, monopoly. Now, we obviously don't have a single buyer of real estate. However, a large enough portion of people who are in the real estate market, who are buyers or renters of real estate in that market, are experiencing the exact same problem. And so they are all incapable of paying for the good. In this case, you have this market breakdown where too many people lose a necessity at once that the government then can't cope, nor can the economy, really, right? All of these people being thrown out onto the street would be absolutely devastating for the local economy, for the local culture, and for government services. And so only because this bizarre situation in which so many people are experiencing the same problem simultaneously do we have a breakdown of the natural market order. I say natural, but it's, none of these things are natural. It's actually something that the government manages and structures, which is why there's no such thing as free market capitalism, and government is there by the secret admission of market fundamentalists to actually manage this thing. But I digress. Because of this catastrophic collective action problem of too many people losing their homes at once, you have the only solution to the collective action problem with collective action, government intervention, which in this case is the bailout of the tenants, which ends up bailing out the landlords. It's to think of economies. I don't know if we like to think of economies, but economies and economics are often divorced from societal implications. That is sort of the main thesis of the Republican Party, that the making money by fossil fuel industries and gun manufacturers have no societal impact, and they're not responsible for any societal impact that they have. This mass eviction would have a very clear societal impact, which simply the government cannot allow. And that is why this is a unique situation. But the government's hands being tied by the incapacity to simply take property and do with it what it would like, means that the bailout of landlords is very likely to be the most workable solution. Let's see some comments on that. I hope I flamed, but ultimately, I'm not willing to just stand up and say, who cares about the Constitution? We should just be advocating for things that will make people's lives better, even if in the long run, or even in the short or medium run, it empowers the government to do things that, in the hands of somebody like Donald Trump, we would never, ever want to see happen. Just remember that any power you give the government might be something that Donald Trump uses might be something that Donald Trump uses an excuse to do with an executive action. And taking people's property is just a really big one. Gosh, I'm just reminded of something somebody said, which is like, people who voted against the Andrew Cuomo, they passed an emergency bill to give him a bunch of power. People who voted for that are in support of the cancel rent. And it's just like, emergency powers for the governor at least are constitutional. Canceling rent is unconstitutional. If you want to constrain government power, you're not doing a great job by eroding constitutional safeguards. Anyway, whatever. Bankrupting landlords ultimately undermines the tax base, which undermines essential government programs, which serve the middle and lower classes. That's certainly true, but at the same time, we could say, just give money directly to the governments. Simon Sachs. Eminent domain refers to the power of the government to take private property and convert it into public use. The Fifth Amendment provides that the government may only exercise this power if they provide just compensation to the property owners. The Fifth Amendment, I see. Let's Google it. What is the Fifth Amendment? I can't remember. I should know this. I know all the amendments, or at least I pretend to. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless the presentment of indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service of time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life and limbs, the double jeopardy, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. Oh yeah, I take the fifth, right? Yeah. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property. Oh, without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Okay, so actually, cancel rent is almost guaranteed to be unconstitutional against the Fifth Amendment. What the hell am I talking about? What's the Fourth Amendment? Is that quartering? No. It's search and seizure. So the Fourth and Fifth Amendments combine to give us due process. Search and seizure, you need due process. But actually, the taking of private property for public use, which is separate from seizure of property, a criminal matter, that is strictly forbidden by the Constitution. So there's no question now that Brian Kavanaugh is right in my mind. Okay, so thank you, Simon. That was a really good get. Jason Haas, good friend of mine from the Obama campaign, says, word. Michael Kaplan, by the way, I saw a group of people badly in need of a union organizer the other day. They work for a billionaire chocolate manufacturer, who maintains horrible working conditions and gives orders by playing a flute at them. He never lets them leave the factory and calls them a horrible name, Oompa Loompa. Thanks, Michael. I'm sure he's going out of business soon. There's a pandemic, in case you haven't heard. Simon Sachs, search and seizure. Yes. We got it. I appreciate that. Michael Kaplan, you may have been thinking of the 14th Amendment. No, I know what the 14th Amendment does. 14th Amendment is naturalization and applies the Constitution to the states. So there you have it. Now, what was the last component of this? So Brian Kavanaugh told us about the potential solutions. We talked about, whatever the first thing I said was. And the last thing we spoke about with Kavanaugh was, oh, bloody hell. I wrote it down. So now I got to go find it. is obviously a humongous issue. There aren't no easy answers to this one. And ultimately, as I mentioned, the federal government has a huge role to play, and they simply don't seem to want to do it. Oh, yeah, right. We spoke about how there is actually no real rent moratorium. And, oh, yes, the Tenant Safe Harbor Act. So there is no true rent moratorium, but there is the New York Safe Harbor Act. But all that does is it says that you can never be evicted. And I want to clarify this because it's important. You can never be evicted in New York State for rent that you are unable to pay because of the pandemic. Now, that might sound like an eviction moratorium, but it's not quite the same because even though you can't be evicted for not paying your rent because of the pandemic, landlords can still go to court and have your assets seized, basically. They can have your wages garnished, they can have your assets seized to recoup them. So even though, yes, it prevents you from being evicted, it doesn't prevent your landlord from driving you into destitution. And so eviction might be the better solution if you think your landlord is going to effectively go to court and seize all of your assets. In any event, if you want to be involved in conversations like that and have access to your local elected officials, some of whom might serve on the committees for issues that you care deeply about, I highly suggest getting in touch with your local Democratic club. And if you don't know who that is or how to reach them, get in touch with me. I'm always happy to help. But that being said, I am super duper hungry, and it looks like we've worked through the questions. So the last thing I'll say is Boston College today came out with a statement saying that they've adjusted their policy so that you can posthumously be awarded a degree, which I just think is wonderful. It means that if you go to Boston College and you work hard for your degree, and because they're requiring in-person classes, the debt that you pass on to your family that you incurred going to college won't have been for naught. You'll still get your degree, even though you're dead. And therefore, all of that value that you transferred to the university and all of that you incurred is meaningful. All right. And with that, I'll see you all tomorrow at 9 p.m.